Captain General Valorous of the Adeptus Custodes stood before the Golden Throne and realized something that should have been obvious centuries ago. They were lying to him. Not directly. You can't lie to the Emperor. Not really. His psychic power, even diminished, even shattered across 10,000 years of agony, could still pierce any deception, could still read the truth buried in mortal minds. But you can lie around him. You can build a civilization on lies and then tell him it's what he wanted. You can take his name and use it to justify everything he spent his existence fighting against. And if he's too broken to stop you, if he's trapped on a golden throne, kept barely alive by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day, too shattered to speak or act or correct the course of the Imperium that claims to serve him, then you can do whatever you want. Valorous had served for 300 years, had stood watch over the throne, had witnessed the daily horror of the Emperor's endless dying, had listened to the ecclesiarchy preach about the God Emperor's divine will, had watched the High Lords make decisions in his name that contradicted everything the Emperor had actually stood for, and he'd never questioned it. Because questioning was heresy, because the system was 10,000 years old, because surely, if the Emperor disapproved, he would have found a way to let them know. Except, what if he couldn't? What if the Emperor had been screaming silently for 10 millennia, watching his Imperium become everything he'd fought to prevent, and he was too damaged to do anything except hold the Astronomicon steady and keep the webway sealed? What if the Imperium's greatest fear wasn't that the Emperor would die? What if their greatest fear was that he would heal? Valorous never spoke this thought aloud, never shared it with his fellow custodians, never filed a report. He just stood his watch, performed his duties, and wondered, quietly, desperately, what would happen if the master of mankind ever opened his eyes again and saw what they'd built in his name. He suspected he knew the answer, and it terrified him more than any demon ever could. This is the secret at the heart of the Imperium, the truth that nobody with power wants to confront. The Emperor's endless dying isn't just a tragedy. For the people who run the Imperium in his name, it's a convenience. Because if he ever woke up, if he ever truly returned, the first thing he'd do is destroy them all. If this kind of analysis is what you're here for, the uncomfortable truths beneath the setting surface, hit that like button now. It tells the algorithm this matters. And we're about to go deep. Let me show you what the Emperor actually wanted, and how thoroughly the Imperium betrayed it. The Emperor of mankind didn't want to be a god. This isn't interpretation. This isn't speculation. This is documented, recorded, confirmed by everyone who knew him during the Great Crusade. The Emperor explicitly, repeatedly, emphatically rejected divinity. He didn't want worship, didn't want temples, didn't want priests or prayers or any of the religious infrastructure that now dominates the Imperium. He wanted the exact opposite. He wanted humanity to outgrow gods entirely. This was the imperial truth, the foundational doctrine of the Great Crusade, the principle that the Emperor personally designed and enforced with extreme prejudice. And it went like this: there are no gods. There is no divine. There is only humanity and the material universe. Any entity claiming to be a god is either a liar or a warp predator using superstition to exploit the ignorant. Religion is a poison that has held humanity back for millennia. It must be eliminated, purged, eradicated from human consciousness. He wasn't subtle about this, wasn't diplomatic. When the Great Crusade encountered human worlds that had maintained religious traditions through old night, the Emperor gave them a choice. Abandon your faith or be brought into compliance by force. Thousands of worlds chose force, and the Emperor burned them, not because they were chaos-corrupted, not because they worshipped the ruinous powers, just because they worshipped anything at all. The word-bearers learned this the hard way. Lorgar, the most faithful of the Primarchs, the one who genuinely loved the Emperor, who saw him as the divine made manifest, who wanted nothing more than to spread worship of the God Emperor across the galaxy. The Emperor's response? He sent Guilliman and the Ultramarines to destroy Monarchia, the perfect city Lorgar had built, the crown jewel of the word-bearer's conquests, a monument to faith, razed it, every temple, every shrine, every prayer hall, reduced to ash and rubble. Then he forced Lorgar and his entire legion to kneel in the ruins while he explained, with absolute clarity, that he was not a god and would never accept worship. This wasn't cruelty. Not from the Emperor's perspective. This was necessary, essential, because he understood something that the current Imperium refuses to acknowledge. Faith gives the warp power. The Chaos Gods exist because mortals believe in them. Because emotions and concepts and worship in the material realm create echoes in the immaterium. The more people believe, the stronger those echoes become. Strong enough, eventually, to achieve consciousness. To become entities. To become gods. The Emperor knew this. Had known it for millennia. Had spent his entire immortal existence fighting against it. Because he understood that any god, even one born from positive emotions, even one that starts benevolent, will eventually become a predator. That's what gods are in 40K. Not beings to be worshipped, parasites to be starved. And the way you starve them, you stop believing in them. You embrace rationality, science, material truth. You reject the supernatural entirely. Make humanity so focused on the physical universe that the warp has nothing to feed on. That was the plan. The whole plan. Conquer the galaxy. Eliminate religion. Guide humanity into a psychic awakening where every human could safely navigate the warp without succumbing to it. Create a species that was immune to chaos because they understood it as a natural phenomenon rather than divine mystery. The Webway project was part of this. Building human infrastructure that didn't require warp travel. That would let humanity expand without feeding the Chaos Gods through the fear and desperation that comes with warp transit. Everything the Emperor did, every decision he made, was aimed at one goal: make humanity independent of the warp and the entities that live there. And it was working. By the late Great Crusade, billions of humans across thousands of worlds had been brought into compliance with the imperial truth. Religion was dying. Superstition was fading. The Mechanicum was the only major exception, and the Emperor tolerated them only because he needed their manufacturing capacity and couldn't afford to fight them while also fighting everyone else. But the trend was clear. Another century, maybe two, and the imperial truth would be universal. Humanity would be rational, scientific, secular, and the Chaos Gods would be starved of the worship and belief that sustained them. Then the Horus heresy happened, and everything the Emperor built collapsed. His Webway project, destroyed. Magnus broke it trying to warn him about Horus. Demons poured through. The Emperor had to sit on the golden throne just to hold the breach sealed. Trapped, unable to leave or the warp would consume Terra itself. His Primarchs? Half-turned traitor. Half remained loyal, but many of those died. The weapons he'd created to conquer the galaxy turned on each other and nearly destroyed humanity in the process. His imperial truth? Shattered. How do you maintain that there are no gods when demons are tearing through reality? When the warp is manifesting physically? When chaos is clearly, obviously real and you can't hide it anymore? You can't. The lie collapses. Or rather, the truth collapses. Because the imperial truth wasn't a lie. It was an attempt to change reality through collective disbelief. And it failed when chaos forced humanity to confront the warp's existence. So the Emperor fell. Mortally wounded by Horus, placed on the golden throne not just to hold the Webway sealed, but to survive it all, kept barely alive by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day, unable to speak, unable to act, unable to guide the Imperium he'd created. And in his absence, everything he'd fought for was systematically dismantled by the people who claimed to serve him. The Imperium didn't just fail to maintain the imperial truth. It inverted it, created the exact opposite of everything the Emperor wanted. They made him a god, not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually literally declared him divine, built the imperial cult, established the ecclesiarchy, made worship of the god emperor the foundational principle of imperial society. The one thing he explicitly forbade became mandatory. The poison he spent 10,000 years trying to purge became the official doctrine. The faith he destroyed civilizations for practicing became the only acceptable belief in his Imperium. And they did it in his name, used his authority to justify the exact thing he would have executed them for. You want to know why the Imperium is terrified of the Emperor awakening? Start here, with the fact that the entire imperial system is built on violating his most fundamental law. That every prayer spoken in his name is heresy by his own definition. That the ecclesiarchy, the single most powerful institution in the Imperium aside from the High Lords themselves, exists solely to perpetuate something he considered a crime against humanity. If the Emperor woke up tomorrow, opened his eyes and saw priests praying to him, saw temples built in his honor, saw the imperial cult consuming the Imperium's resources and attention, he'd burn it all down, just like he burned Monarchia, just like he burned every other religious world that refused to abandon faith. The ecclesiarchy would be first. Every cardinal, every preacher, every confessor, every priest who'd spent their life teaching humanity to worship the Emperor as a god would face his wrath. Because they're doing exactly what he spent the Great Crusade preventing. And that's just the beginning. Because the imperial cult isn't the only thing the Imperium built that contradicts the Emperor's vision. It's just the most obvious, the most blasphemous by his standards. The entire structure of the Imperium, everything it's become over 10,000 years, is a corruption of what he intended. A perversion of his goals, a civilization that wears his symbols while embodying everything he opposed. Let me show you how deep this goes. The Emperor believed in progress. Not just technological progress, though that was part of it. He believed humanity could improve, could evolve, could become something greater than what it was. The entire Great Crusade was built on this principle. Unite humanity. Eliminate the threats holding it back. Create the conditions for humanity to reach its full potential. He was an optimist. In the grimmest possible way. He'd lived through all of human history, seen every atrocity, every failure, every moment where humanity chose wrong, and he still believed they could do better. That's why he built the Imperium in the first place. Not to rule, not for power, but because he genuinely thought that with proper guidance, with the right structure, with enough time, humanity could transcend its limitations. The current Imperium has abandoned this entirely. Progress isn't just discouraged. It's heresy. Innovation is suspect. Change is dangerous. The Mechanicum hoards technology like religious relics and refuses to develop new designs because that would be deviation from the sacred patterns. The Administratum maintains systems that haven't been updated in millennia because updating them would require admitting they were flawed. The entire imperial philosophy is, what exists is what should exist. Any attempt to improve is questioning the Emperor's design. And questioning the Emperor's design is blasphemy. This is the exact opposite of what he wanted. The Emperor was a scientist, a researcher, someone who spent thousands of years experimenting, learning, developing new techniques. The creation of the Primarchs was innovation on a scale never attempted before. The Webway project was trying to rebuild technology that had been lost since the Dark Age. Everything he did involved pushing boundaries and refusing to accept limitations. And now, the Imperium treats the standard template construct as sacred scripture rather than what it actually is, an emergency reference guide for colonists who needed to rebuild from scratch. The Mechanicum worships the Omnicia instead of understanding machines. The entire civilization has become calcified, frozen, incapable of meaningful advancement. They've had 10,000 years. 10,000 years to improve imperial technology, to develop better weapons, better ships, better infrastructure. And what have they accomplished? Nothing. They've spent 10 millennia losing ground. Every year the Imperium is slightly weaker than the year before. Every century more knowledge is lost. Every millennium the decay deepens. This isn't because humanity is incapable of progress. It's because the Imperium actively prevents it, punishes it, treats innovation as a threat to stability rather than a path to survival. The Emperor would be horrified, not just disappointed, genuinely horrified that his species has spent 10,000 years marching backward while claiming to follow his vision. But it gets worse. The Emperor believed in science, rational understanding of the universe, empirical evidence, material truth. He rejected mysticism not because it was always wrong, but because mysticism clouds judgment, makes people susceptible to manipulation, prevents them from understanding the actual mechanisms by which reality operates. The Imperium has embraced mysticism completely. The ecclesiarchy doesn't just preach faith. It actively suppresses scientific understanding. Knowledge is dangerous. Questioning is heresy. The common citizen is kept deliberately ignorant because educated populations are harder to control. This wasn't the plan. The Emperor wanted humanity educated, rational, capable of understanding the universe they lived in. He wanted every human to know enough to resist chaos through comprehension rather than faith. The Imperium does the opposite, keeps people ignorant, feeds them superstition, teaches them that the Emperor works in mysterious ways and questioning his divine plan is the path to damnation. They've turned the most rational being in human history into a mystery cult, made his image the center of irrational faith, used his authority to justify the systematic dumbing down of the species he tried to elevate. And they call this loyalty. They call this serving his will. The Mechanicum is even worse in some ways. They understand technology better than anyone else in the Imperium. But they don't understand it scientifically. They understand it religiously. Machines have spirits. Proper function requires prayer. Maintenance is ritual rather than engineering. This works. Barely. Because the machine spirits are real or real enough. Because faith in 40K has power. Because belief shapes the warp and the warp shapes reality. But that's exactly the problem. The Emperor was trying to break humanity's dependence on the warp. The Mechanicum's approach, treating technology as divine and machines as sacred, just reinforces that dependence. Makes humanity more mystical, more superstitious, more vulnerable to exactly the kind of warp corruption he was fighting against. He tolerated the Mechanicum during the Crusade because he needed them, but he was planning to reform them eventually, to transition them from tech priests to actual scientists, to make them understand the principles rather than just performing the rituals. That never happened. And now the Mechanicum is so entrenched in their beliefs that changing them is impossible. They're the sole source of advanced technology in the Imperium. You can't reform them without collapsing Imperial infrastructure. And you can't maintain Imperial infrastructure without accepting their religious approach to technology. It's a trap. A systemic trap that the Emperor would recognize as everything he fought to prevent. Then there's how the Imperium treats humans. The Emperor wasn't kind, wasn't gentle, wasn't sentimental about human life. He'd authorized the extermination of entire populations if he deemed it necessary, sacrifice billions to save trillions, make cold calculations about which lives mattered and which didn't. But his cruelty had purpose. He killed to protect humanity's future, eliminated threats, removed obstacles to progress. The violence was supposed to lead somewhere, to build toward a future where humanity was strong enough, advanced enough, unified enough to stand without him. The Imperium's cruelty is pointless. They don't sacrifice for future gain. They sacrifice because the system requires sacrifice. Hive worlds aren't terrible because they have to be. They're terrible because the administratum can't be bothered to design better systems. Servitors aren't necessary for most tasks. They're just cheaper than maintaining educated workforces. The Imperium treats human life as disposable not because survival demands it, but because the institutions that run the Imperium benefit from populations that are desperate, ignorant, and replaceable. The Emperor would look at a hive world and ask, "Why are you keeping 10 billion people in these conditions when you could build better? Why are you maintaining structures that guarantee suffering when alternatives exist?" And the administratum's answer would be, "Because this is what we've always done. Because changing it would be expensive. Because the current system is stable even if it's terrible. That stability is what the Imperium has chosen over everything else. Not human flourishing. Not advancement. Not the future the Emperor was building toward. Just stability. The continuation of existing systems regardless of how much they fail at their supposed purpose. This is stagnation masquerading as order. Decay dressed up as tradition. And it's exactly what the Emperor spent his existence fighting against. He fought tyrants who claimed divine right to rule. The Imperium made him a divine tyrant and rules in his name. He fought religious institutions that controlled populations through fear. The Imperium built the ecclesiarchy and made fear-based faith mandatory. He fought ignorance and superstition. The Imperium embraced both and called them piety. He fought stagnation and decay. The Imperium embodies both and calls them stability. Every major institution in the Imperium exists in direct contradiction to the Emperor's stated principles. The ecclesiarchy, the administratum's refusal to reform, the mechanicum's mysticism, the systematic oppression of human populations, the treatment of innovation as heresy, all of it, every piece, built by people who claimed to serve him while systematically dismantling everything he tried to accomplish. And they've been doing this for 10,000 years. Long enough that nobody remembers it was different. Long enough that the current system seems natural, inevitable, the only way things could be. Except it's not. The Emperor proved it's not. The Great Crusade, for all its flaws, showed that humanity could be organized differently, could advance, could improve, could build toward something better. And then the heresy broke everything. And in the aftermath, in the desperate struggle to survive, the survivors made choices. Emergency measures that were supposed to be temporary. Compromises that were supposed to be short-term. Except they never transitioned away from the emergency. Never reformed the temporary measures. Never tried to rebuild what was lost. They just continued. Let the emergency measures calcify into permanent institutions. Let the compromises become doctrine. Let the desperation become normal. And now, 10,000 years later, the emergency is the system. The compromises are the law. And suggesting anything different is heresy. This is what the Emperor would wake up to. Not just a betrayal of his religious principles, though that's bad enough, but a complete inversion of his entire philosophy. A civilization that's taken his name and used it to build exactly the kind of stagnant, superstitious, oppressive empire he spent millennia fighting against. The Imperium isn't protecting humanity. It's consuming it, slowly grinding billions of lives through systems that don't actually serve human flourishing, that only serve the institution's continued existence. And the worst part? It's doing this in his name, claiming that this is what he wanted. That this nightmare of stagnation and superstition and systematic oppression is the fulfillment of his vision. It's not. It's the exact opposite. And if he ever woke up, if he ever regained enough power to act, he would see this immediately. He'd see the priests praying to him and know they were committing exactly the heresy he prohibited. He'd see the administratum maintaining failed systems and know they were choosing comfort over progress. He'd see the mechanicum worshipping machines and know they were reinforcing the warp dependence he was trying to eliminate. He'd see the suffering populations and know the cruelty wasn't necessary, wasn't strategic, was just the result of institutions that had forgotten why they existed and now existed only to perpetuate themselves. And he'd do exactly what he did during the Great Crusade when he encountered civilizations that had failed humanity. He'd bring them into compliance, by force if necessary. Which brings us to the real question, the one that should terrify everyone in power in the Imperium, the one that Captain General Valoris stood before the Golden Throne and couldn't stop thinking about. What happens when he wakes up? Not if, when. Because the Emperor isn't dead. He's healing, slowly, imperceptibly, but the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every day isn't just keeping him alive. It's feeding him, building his strength, allowing his shattered psyche to slowly, over millennia, begin to reform. And when he finally heals enough to act, when he opens his eyes and sees what the Imperium has become in his absence, what do you think he's going to do? Thank them for their service? Praise them for maintaining his legacy? Or recognize them for what they are? The greatest betrayal in human history, wrapped in his symbols and speaking with his stolen authority. Let me show you what his awakening would actually mean. The Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum is one of the High Lords of Terra, commands the faith of trillions, controls resources that rival entire sector governments, speaks with authority that even chapter masters respect. If the emperor woke up, the ecclesiarch would be dead within the hour. Not arrested, not stripped of office, dead, executed. Along with every cardinal, every preacher, every priest who'd spent their lives teaching humanity to worship the emperor as divine. This isn't speculation. We know exactly what the emperor does to religious leaders who defy him. We watched him order the destruction of Monarchia. Watched him humiliate Lorgar and the entire Word-Bearers Legion for the crime of building temples in his name. And Lorgar was his son, Primarch, one of 20 beings the emperor personally created. If he could punish Lorgar that severely for worship, what do you think he'd do to the ecclesiarchy? The organization that spent 10,000 years doing exactly what he forbade, on a scale that makes Lorgar's devotion look modest. Total purge. Complete eradication. Every structure the ecclesiarchy has built would be destroyed. Every shrine dismantled. Every prayer hall burned. Every holy text, texts that claim to speak his will, reduced to ash. And the people, the millions who've dedicated their lives to the imperial cult, gone. Not because the emperor is cruel, but because they're heretics by his own definition. They're doing exactly what he spent the Great Crusade eliminating. The fact that they think they're serving him wouldn't matter. Intent doesn't change the nature of the crime. This is the ecclesiarchy's nightmare. Not that the emperor might die, that he might wake up, because his death would be tragic, but it wouldn't threaten their power. His awakening would end them completely, and they know this. On some level, everyone in the upper echelons of the ecclesiarchy understands that their institution exists because he's unable to stop them. That if he ever regained the ability to act, their first act would be their last. So they pray for his continued suffering. Not openly, not consciously, but their prayers for the emperor's eternal vigil on the golden throne? Those prayers that thank him for his sacrifice? They're really prayers that he stays trapped, that he never heals, that the sacrifice continues forever because the alternative is their annihilation. The ecclesiarchy wouldn't be alone in their destruction. The Adeptus Administratum, the bureaucratic machine that actually runs the Imperium, would face a reckoning almost as severe. Not for religious reasons, for competence ones. The emperor was many things. Secretive, brutal, willing to sacrifice billions for strategic objectives. But he was never inefficient, never wasteful. Every decision he made served a purpose, advanced his goals, moved humanity toward the future he envisioned. The Administratum is a monument to inefficiency. It takes decades to process requisition orders, centuries to update census data, millennia to reform failed policies. It's a system that operates on bureaucratic inertia rather than actual function, where following procedure matters more than achieving results, where preserving the chain of command takes priority over saving lives. The emperor would look at this and see exactly what it is: institutional decay dressed up as order. He'd purge it. Not completely. The Imperium needs administration. Needs people to manage logistics and coordinate resources and maintain records. But it doesn't need this bloated, calcified, self-perpetuating bureaucracy that exists primarily to justify its own existence. How many administrators would survive? Hard to say. Depends on how many can actually justify their positions. How many can demonstrate that their role serves humanity rather than just serving the system? Not many. The Administratum has spent 10,000 years creating jobs that don't need to exist. Entire departments dedicated to managing paperwork that documents nothing useful. Millions of scribes recording information that nobody will ever reference. Layer upon layer of oversight that adds no value except slowing everything down. The emperor would see this and do what he always did with waste. Eliminate it. The human cost would be staggering. Millions of administrators executed or reassigned. Entire bureaucratic structures dismantled overnight. Processes that have existed for millennia suddenly replaced with whatever system the emperor designed in an afternoon because he actually understands efficiency. It would be chaos. Absolute chaos. Because the Administratum, for all its flaws, is what keeps the Imperium running. Remove it suddenly and you don't just lose the waste. You lose the essential functions buried within the waste. But the emperor wouldn't care about the transition costs. He'd care about fixing a broken system. And the administratum is irreparably broken. So it would burn. And millions of people whose entire lives were spent maintaining that broken system would burn with it. Then there's the High Lords of Terra themselves. 12 individuals who rule the Imperium in the Emperor's name. Who make decisions that affect trillions. Who coordinate humanity's defense against countless threats. Who maintain what stability the Imperium still possesses. They serve at the Emperor's pleasure. Theoretically, in practice, they serve themselves. Each High Lord represents a different power block. Each one is there because their institution is too powerful to exclude from governance. And each one uses their position to advance their institution's interests over the Imperium's. This is normal politics. Expected. The High Lords balance competing interests and try to reach decisions that benefit the Imperium as a whole, even if those decisions are compromises that satisfy nobody completely. The Emperor doesn't do politics. Doesn't compromise. Doesn't balance competing interests unless that balance serves his strategic objectives. He'd look at the High Lords and see what they are. Mid-level administrators who've convinced themselves they're statesmen. People playing political games while the Imperium crumbles. Wasting time and resources on internal maneuvering instead of addressing actual threats. He wouldn't negotiate with them. Wouldn't try to work within their system. He'd replace them. All of them. Immediately. With people who understood that their job was to execute his vision, not to debate it. Some might survive. The ones who were competent and loyal and capable of setting aside institutional loyalty for genuine service. But most would be dismissed at best. Executed at worst if he determined their political games had materially harmed humanity's survival. And what would replace them? Probably nothing resembling the current system. The Emperor doesn't need 12 power brokers. He needs efficient administration. He'd design something fit for purpose rather than something designed to prevent any single faction from gaining too much power. The entire political structure of the Imperium would collapse. Not because the Emperor wanted to be a tyrant, but because he'd see the current system as an obstacle to effective action. As something that was supposed to be temporary, a way to coordinate during his absence, but that had calcified into permanent governance. He'd dissolve it, replace it with direct rule. And the thousands of people whose power depended on the High Lord system would suddenly have no power at all. The Mechanicum would face the most interesting reckoning. Because they're necessary. The Imperium can't function without them. Can't maintain its technology. Can't manufacture new equipment. Can't keep the ships flying and the guns firing without the Mechanicum's knowledge and infrastructure. So the Emperor couldn't just purge them. Not completely. He'd need them. At least in the short term. At least until he could build alternative systems. But he'd reform them. Forcibly. Immediately. With the kind of brutal efficiency that brooks no resistance. The Omnicia? Gone. The Emperor would make it clear that he is not the Omnicia. Never was. The Mechanicum's religion is exactly the kind of superstition he was trying to eliminate. They'd be ordered to abandon it. To approach technology scientifically rather than religiously. Some would comply. The ones who understood that the rituals were just effective engineering practices dressed in religious language. The ones who could make the transition from tech priest to scientist without losing their effectiveness. Many wouldn't. The ones for whom the faith is real. Who genuinely believe machines have spirits. Who can't separate the religious understanding from the technical understanding. They'd resist. Argue that the religious approach works. That the Emperor doesn't understand the machine spirits the way they do. The Emperor would not be patient with this argument. He'd prove, probably through direct psychic demonstration, that machine spirits are warp phenomena. That the Mechanicum's faith-based approach to technology is making humanity dependent on the warp. That this is exactly what he was trying to prevent. And then he'd demand compliance. Not request. Demand. With the implicit threat that resistance means replacement. This would fracture the Mechanicum. Some Forge worlds would accept the new order. Others would resist. A few might even declare independence. Refuse to abandon their faith even for the Emperor himself. Those worlds would be brought into compliance by force. Just like during the Great Crusade. The emperor doesn't tolerate institutions that refuse his authority when that authority is necessary for humanity's survival. So the Mechanicum would survive. But not in its current form. Not with its current beliefs. It would be torn apart and rebuilt into something secular. Scientific. Rational. Something the emperor could actually use without it feeding the warp through mysticism. The Space Marine chapters would face scrutiny too, because they're not what he intended. The legions were supposed to be conquest forces, tools for uniting humanity. Once that goal was achieved, once the galaxy was pacified, the legions were supposed to be transitioned, reformed, made into something peacetime appropriate. That obviously didn't happen. The chapters are still organized for war, still operating on the assumption that humanity needs transhuman warriors in active deployment. And the grim reality is, they're right. The galaxy is hostile enough that Space Marines remain necessary. But the Emperor would look at how they're organized now, the chapter system, the 1,000 Marine limit, the division of the legions, and ask, is this optimal? Probably not. The chapter system was designed to prevent another Horus, to ensure no single Space Marine commander could threaten Terra. It's a political solution to a military problem. And political solutions to military problems tend to reduce effectiveness. The Emperor might reunite the chapters, reform the legions, create a single unified Astartes force under direct Imperial command. Or he might design something completely different, some new organization that serves his current objectives rather than addressing threats from 10,000 years ago. Either way, the chapters as they exist would change. And chapter masters who'd spent centuries building their independence would suddenly find themselves subordinated to central authority again. Some would welcome this, the chance to serve the Emperor directly, to finally receive the guidance they've been operating without for millennia, to know that their actions align with his will rather than just their interpretation of it. Others would resist, would argue that their chapter's traditions matter, that 10,000 years of independence has created distinct cultures worth preserving. That centralization would lose valuable institutional knowledge. The Emperor would not care about traditions, would not value culture for its own sake. He'd care about effectiveness, about creating an Astartes force optimized for current threats rather than weighed down by historical accident. So the chapters would change, probably dramatically, and many Space Marines would struggle with that, would have to choose between loyalty to their chapter's traditions and loyalty to the Emperor himself. Most would choose the Emperor, because that's what they were conditioned to do. But the emotional cost would be severe. Watching your chapter's identity dissolved, your brothers reassigned, your traditions declared obsolete. It would be necessary, but it would hurt, and the Space Marines, for all their conditioning, still feel pain. This is what the Emperor's awakening would mean for the Imperium's power structures. Not reform, not gradual improvement, total upheaval. The destruction of institutions that have existed for millennia. The execution or dismissal of millions who've built their lives around those institutions. The forcible reorganization of everything from religion to bureaucracy to military structure. And all of it happening fast. Because the Emperor doesn't wait, doesn't ease people into change. He identifies what needs to be done and does it. Immediately, with overwhelming force if necessary. The Imperium would survive. Probably, it would emerge stronger, more efficient, more aligned with its original purpose, actually capable of advancing humanity rather than just maintaining the status quo. But the transition would be catastrophic. Billions of lives disrupted, millions killed, entire social structures dissolved overnight. And nobody currently in power would keep that power. Nobody who's benefited from the current system would benefit from the new one. That's why they're terrified. Not for humanity. Humanity might actually be better off with the Emperor awake. But for themselves, for their institutions, for their power, his awakening would be the end of everything they've built, everything they've dedicated their lives to maintaining. So they pray he stays asleep, trapped, suffering on the golden throne, unable to see what they've done in his name. Because if he ever opens his eyes and sees, the Imperium as it exists would end. and something closer to what he actually wanted might finally begin. Let's assume it happens. The Emperor heals enough to leave the Golden Throne, opens his eyes, stands, speaks, returns to active command of the Imperium that bears his name. What does he do first? Not what you'd expect. Not grand declarations. Not dramatic confrontations with the ecclesiarchy. The Emperor is, above all else, practical. He'd assess, analyze, understand exactly what state humanity is in before taking action. He'd spend time, maybe days, maybe weeks, just looking, seeing what 10,000 years of his absence has created. Reading reports, examining data, listening to advisors, understanding the scale of the problems he's facing. And then he'd act with the kind of systematic efficiency that built an empire in a few centuries. Step 1. Secure Terra. Before anything else, before any reforms or purges or reorganizations, he'd need to ensure his seat of power was actually under his control. That seems obvious. The Emperor is on Terra. Terra is the Imperium's capital. Of course, it's under his control. Except it's not. Not really. Terra is administered by dozens of competing factions. The High Lords, the Ecclesiarchy, the Administratum, the Adeptus Arbites, the Inquisition, each one operating semi-independently, each one with their own power base, their own resources, their own chains of command. The Emperor would need to consolidate this, fast, before anyone could organize resistance, before the institutions he's about to dismantle could coordinate a defense. He'd start with the custodians, the only force on Terra that answers directly to him, that was created specifically to protect him and execute his will. They'd be his instrument, his enforcement mechanism, and he'd deploy them immediately to secure key locations: the palace, the administratum archives, the ecclesiarchal holdings, communications infrastructure, anything that could be used to organize resistance or spread propaganda opposing his return. This wouldn't be a battle. Not really. Nobody on Terra would fight the Emperor. The moment he walks out of the throne room, fully healed and radiating the psychic power that makes primarchs look like children, everyone would fall in line. Or at least pretend to. But securing physical control is just the start. He'd need to secure informational control too. Make sure that when he starts making changes, his version of events is what people hear. Not the ecclesiarchies, not the High Lords, so he'd take over Imperial communications. All of them, Vox networks, astropathic channels, data archives, everything. Make it impossible for anyone to spread a counter-narrative without his knowledge. Only then, once Terra was secured and he controlled the flow of information, would he begin the actual reforms. Step 2. Address the ecclesiarchy. Not with violence. Not initially. With a declaration. A clear, unambiguous statement broadcast across the entire Imperium. I am not a god. I have never been a god. Worship of my person is heresy against my own teachings. The imperial cult is dissolved. Effective immediately. Simple. Direct. Impossible to misinterpret. The Emperor doesn't waste words. The reaction would be chaos. Absolute chaos. Trillions of humans who've spent their entire lives worshipping the God Emperor suddenly told that their faith is a lie. That the Emperor himself rejects it. That everything the ecclesiarchy taught them was heresy. Most would comply, because it's the Emperor speaking. His authority is absolute. If he says he's not a god, then he's not a god. Case closed. But many wouldn't. Many couldn't. Their faith is too deeply ingrained, too central to their identity. They'd reject the message, argue that it's a test of faith, or that the Emperor doesn't understand his own divinity, or that demons are impersonating him. These are the ones who'd have to be dealt with by force. Not killed, necessarily, but removed from positions of influence, silenced, prevented from spreading their counter-narrative. The ecclesiarchy's leadership would be dismantled. Cardinals executed or imprisoned. Preachers silenced. The organization's assets seized. Its churches repurposed. Its texts burned. Everything the ecclesiarchy built over 10,000 years erased in a matter of months. This would create a spiritual void. Billions of humans suddenly without the faith that gave their suffering meaning. Without the prayers that got them through each day. Without the promise of the Emperor's divine protection. The Emperor would fill that void with purpose. Not faith, purpose. A return to the imperial truth. An explanation of what humanity is fighting for that doesn't require worship. That focuses on survival, progress, the material goal of securing humanity's future against the galaxy's threats. Would this satisfy people? Probably not. Not emotionally. The imperial truth is cold, rational. It doesn't provide the comfort that faith does. Doesn't promise reward after death. Doesn't give suffering cosmic meaning. But the Emperor wouldn't care about emotional satisfaction. He'd care about breaking humanity's dependence on belief-based structures, about making them strong enough to face reality without the crutch of religion. It would work, eventually, over generations. As the older generations who remember the imperial cult die off and younger generations grow up with the imperial truth as the only worldview they've known. But in the short term, it would be painful, disruptive, would probably trigger rebellions on worlds where faith runs particularly deep. The Emperor would suppress those rebellions, efficiently, ruthlessly, because allowing them to continue would mean allowing the Chaos Gods to feed on the worship those rebels were redirecting. Step 3. Reform the administratum. This is where things get complicated, because the administratum is massive. Billions of administrators across millions of worlds. You can't just dissolve it. Can't replace it overnight. The Imperium would collapse without administrative infrastructure. So the Emperor would do something more subtle. He'd rebuild it from within. Start by identifying the competent administrators. The ones who actually understand their jobs. Who make decisions that improve efficiency rather than just following procedure. Who serve humanity rather than just serving the system. Promote them, rapidly. Give them authority to reform their own departments, to eliminate waste, to fire incompetent subordinates, to redesign processes that don't work. This creates a cascade. Competent administrators promoting competent subordinates, eliminating layers of useless oversight, replacing Byzantine processes with efficient ones. It spreads through the system like a virus, the good kind, the kind that kills disease. Meanwhile, remove the leadership, the highest-ranking administrators who've spent centuries perfecting bureaucratic politics. Replace them with people who understand logistics, engineering, systems design, people who can look at the administratum and see what it should be rather than just accepting what it is. This would take years, maybe decades. You can't reform a bureaucracy this large quickly. But the Emperor would start the process, set the direction, create the incentive structures that reward efficiency and punish waste. And he'd back it with threat. Make it clear that administrators who resist reform, who prioritize procedure over results, who engage in bureaucratic obstruction, will be removed. Permanently, probably violently. Fear works. It's not elegant, but it works. And the Emperor has never been squeamish about using fear when it serves his purposes. The result would be an administratum that's maybe half the size, more efficient, more responsive, actually capable of coordinating imperial logistics rather than just documenting its own failure to coordinate. Would it be perfect? No. Bureaucracies are never perfect. But it would be functional. And functional is a massive improvement over what exists now. Step 4. Address the mechanicum. This is the hardest problem. Because the mechanicum isn't just an institution. It's an entire culture. You can't just order the tech priests to stop being religious and expect them to comply. The Emperor would need to offer them something. A replacement for the faith he's taking away. Something that satisfies their need for meaning while moving them toward scientific understanding. He'd do this through knowledge. Direct knowledge. The Emperor understands technology better than anyone in the mechanicum. Better than anyone in human history except maybe some Dark Age scientists. He'd share that knowledge. Demonstrate it. Show the tech priests that the rituals work because of underlying principles, not divine favor. Some would be fascinated, would embrace this, would see it as the omniscia finally revealing the true nature of the machine spirits, would make the transition from faith to science because they genuinely want to understand. Others would reject it entirely, would see it as the emperor trying to destroy their faith, would resist with everything they have because the faith is the only thing that gives their work meaning. The emperor would split the mechanicum, intentionally, offer the knowledge to those who'll accept it, allow them to form a new organization, a scientific mechanicum, one that understands machines rather than worshipping them. The ones who refuse, the fundamentalists, he'd isolate them, deny them resources, deny them access to new technology. Make it clear that the future belongs to the scientific mechanicum and the faithful one is being left behind. This would force a choice. Continue in isolation with declining resources and obsolete knowledge, or abandon the faith and join the new system. Most would eventually choose the new system, because pragmatism overrides faith when the alternative is irrelevance. But the transition would be painful, would feel like betrayal, would fracture relationships and destroy communities that had existed for millennia. The emperor would consider this an acceptable cost, because the alternative is allowing the mechanicum to continue reinforcing humanity's warp dependence through technology worship. And that's a cost he won't accept. Step 5. Reorganize the military. The Imperial Guard needs minimal changes. They're already organized for efficiency, already focus on material reality rather than mysticism. The emperor would approve of how they operate, might make them more uniform, might standardize equipment and training across regiments. But the basic structure works. The Space Marines are different. They need fundamental reform. The chapter system would end, not because it's bad, but because it's designed to prevent problems that no longer exist. Horus is dead. The traitor legions are in the eye of terror. The threat of a Primarch-led rebellion is gone. What remains are external threats. Orcs, Tyranids, Necrons, chaos incursions. These require coordinated military response, not independent chapters operating on their own judgment. The emperor would reunite the Astartes, not as legions. Those are too large, too unwieldy, but as a single unified force under direct imperial command, with standardized doctrine, coordinated deployment, centralized logistics. Some chapter masters would resist this, would argue that their independence is valuable, that their unique tactics and traditions are worth preserving. The emperor would demonstrate otherwise, would show them combat data, prove that coordinated Astartes forces are more effective than independent chapters. Make it a question of efficiency rather than pride. Most would accept it, because deep down, most Space Marines want to serve the emperor directly, want his guidance, want to know they're fighting the right battles in the right way. The ones who won't accept it, the ones too attached to their chapter's independence, they'd be given a choice: comply or be disbanded. There's no third option. No room for Astartes forces that refuse imperial authority when the emperor is personally giving orders. This would hurt, would destroy traditions that chapters have maintained for 10,000 years. But it would create a more effective fighting force. And effectiveness is what matters. Step 6. Address the wider Imperium. Everything so far has been internal, reforming imperial institutions. But the Imperium isn't just institutions. It's a million worlds, each with their own governments, their own cultures, their own ways of operating. The emperor would leave most of them alone. As long as they pay their tithes and don't worship chaos, he doesn't care how they organize themselves. Local autonomy isn't a problem. Local autonomy is efficient. You can't micromanage a million worlds from Terra. But some worlds would need direct intervention. The ones that have become too corrupt, too dysfunctional, too dangerous to leave unsupervised. He'd send expeditions, not to conquer, to reform, to remove failed leadership and install competent governors, to break up power structures that were exploiting their populations beyond usefulness. This would look a lot like the Great Crusade. Military forces arriving, assessing, demanding compliance, using force when compliance is refused. But the goal is different. Not unity, not expansion. Just ensuring that imperial worlds actually function as part of the Imperium rather than as independent fiefdoms that happen to pay nominal tribute. Would any of this be better? That's the question nobody wants to ask. Because the answer is complicated. For humanity as a species, probably yes. The Emperor's Imperium would be more efficient, more rational, more focused on material survival rather than empty symbolism. It would advance, improve, actually work toward a future instead of just maintaining the present. For individual humans, mixed. The Emperor isn't kind, doesn't prioritize individual happiness, doesn't care about preserving cultures or traditions or ways of life that don't serve his objectives. People would lose things they value: faith, community traditions, local autonomy in some cases, the comfort of knowing their place in a stable system. They'd gain a future, a real one, a chance for humanity to actually survive long-term rather than just delaying extinction. Better technology, better organization, better odds. Is that trade worth it? Depends on your values. If you prioritize human flourishing in the present, the Emperor's Imperium might seem cruel. If you prioritize human survival in the future, it might seem necessary. The Emperor would choose survival. Every time. Without hesitation. Because that's who he is. That's who he's always been. A being willing to sacrifice everything, including his own comfort, his own life, his own immortality, to ensure humanity has a future. Whether that makes him a hero or a tyrant depends on your perspective. And the Imperium's current leadership has a very clear perspective on that question. Which brings us to the final piece of this puzzle. The reason why, despite everything, the Emperor will probably never wake up. Not because he can't heal, but because too many people have too much invested in making sure he doesn't. The custodians guard the Golden Throne in shifts. 800 at any given time. Standing watch. Protecting the Emperor. Making sure nothing disturbs his eternal vigil. But protecting him from what? External threats? Sure. Demons. Assassins. Chaos cults trying to reach Terra. That's the official explanation. The justification for 10,000 custodians spending their lives standing watch over a dying god. Except the real threat to the Emperor isn't external. It never was. The real threat is what happens if he heals. If he wakes up. If he tries to leave the throne. The custodians know this. On some level, they all know this. Their job isn't just to protect the Emperor from harm. It's to protect the Imperium from the Emperor. Not consciously. Not officially, but the effect is the same. They stand between him and the outside world. They control who gets access to him, what information reaches him, what happens in his presence. And they make damn sure nothing disrupts his current state. Nothing that might accelerate his healing. Nothing that might give him the strength to act. Because if he acts, if he leaves that throne, the first thing he'd do is judge them. Judge the custodians for standing watch while the Imperium became everything he opposed. For protecting institutions that betray his principles. For enabling 10,000 years of heresy through their inaction. Some custodians would pass that judgment. The ones who've genuinely tried to uphold the imperial truth. Who've resisted the ecclesiarchy when they could. Who've maintained his original vision even when everyone else abandoned it. Most wouldn't pass. Most have compromised, made accommodations, accepted the imperial cult because fighting it was impossible, allowed the decay because preventing it was beyond their power. The Emperor wouldn't care about impossibility, wouldn't accept we couldn't stop it as justification. He'd see what they allowed to happen and judge them failures, unworthy of their position, complicit in the Imperium's corruption. So the custodians have an incentive. Not a conscious conspiracy, just an unspoken understanding that the current situation, as terrible as it is preferable to the alternative. That the Emperor's continued suffering is tragic but manageable. That his awakening would be catastrophic. They're not alone in this calculation. The Adeptus Mechanicus operates the Golden Throne, maintains its systems, keeps it functional, They understand how it works better than anyone else. Better than the custodians. Better than the High Lords. Maybe better than anyone except the Emperor himself. And they know things they haven't shared. Technical details about the throne's function. About what it would take to heal the Emperor fully. About whether he could leave it without Terra being consumed by the warp breach beneath the palace. The official position is that he can't. That the moment he leaves the throne, the webway breach reopens and demons flood Terra. That his continued suffering is the only thing preventing humanity's capital from becoming a demon world. This might be true. Probably is true to some extent. The breach is real. The threat is real. But the Mechanicus has never tested alternatives. Never tried to find another solution. Never seriously investigated whether there might be a way to seal the breach without the Emperor's direct intervention. Because why would they? The current situation works for them. The Emperor is trapped. Can't interfere with their faith. Can't force them to abandon the Omnicia. Can't demand they become scientists instead of priests. As long as he's on the throne, they're free to practice their religion. To worship the machine god. To maintain their independence from imperial authority. If he woke up, that freedom ends. He'd reform them by force. Destroy their faith. Turn them into exactly the kind of scientific institution he originally wanted. So the Mechanicus has no incentive to heal him. Every incentive to keep him trapped. To maintain the throne at minimum functionality. To ensure he survives but never recovers. They'd never say this openly. Never admit it even to themselves. But the choice is clear. Invest resources into potentially healing the Emperor, with all the uncertainty and disruption that would bring. Or invest resources into maintaining the status quo, which is stable and predictable. They choose stability. Every time. Because that's what institutions do. They preserve themselves. And healing the Emperor threatens their self-preservation. The ecclesiarchy's incentives are even more obvious. They've spent 10,000 years building an empire of faith. Trillions of believers. Millions of churches. Resources that rival sector governments. Power that even space marines respect. All of it built on a lie. The lie that the Emperor is a god. That he wants worship. That faith in him provides protection and salvation. If he wakes up and refutes that lie, if he declares that the entire ecclesiarchy is heretical, their empire collapses overnight. Their power evaporates. Their entire purpose for existing disappears. They can't allow that. Can't risk it. Their institutional survival depends on the Emperor remaining silent. Unable to contradict their narrative. Unable to tell humanity that everything the ecclesiarchy teaches is exactly what he forbade. So they have a stake in his continued suffering. Not openly, not as policy, but as practical reality. The ecclesiarchy prays for the Emperor's eternal vigil, praises his sacrifice, thanks him for his protection from the golden throne. They're praying he stays trapped. That's what those prayers really mean, because his freedom is their destruction. And they know it. Every cardinal, every preacher with enough intelligence to think through the implications. They know that the Emperor's awakening would be the end of everything they've built. So they don't work toward his healing. Don't research methods to revive him. Don't pray for his recovery. They pray for his continued sacrifice, his eternal suffering, his unending vigil. They're praying for him to never wake up, and calling it devotion. The High Lords of Terra have the most complex incentives, because they actually want the Imperium to function. Want humanity to survive, want to defend against external threats and maintain some level of stability. They're not cartoonish villains. They're administrators trying to do an impossible job. But they're also people who've built their careers within the current system, who've learned to navigate imperial politics, who've made accommodations and compromises, who've accepted that the Imperium is corrupt and dysfunctional but maintained it anyway because the alternative is collapse. The Emperor's awakening would make all their experience irrelevant, all their political skills useless. He doesn't do politics, doesn't negotiate, doesn't balance competing interests unless that balance serves his strategic goals. He'd replace them, immediately, with people who fit his vision rather than people who've mastered the current system. And the High Lords, for all their power, would become obsolete overnight. So they have an incentive to maintain the status quo, to keep the Emperor on the throne, to praise his sacrifice while quietly ensuring nothing disrupts it. They'd never frame it this way, would never admit they're preventing his recovery. They'd say they're being realistic, practical, that healing him might not be possible, that the risks outweigh the benefits, that the Imperium needs stability more than it needs him awake. All true to some extent, but also convenient justifications for inaction, for choosing the comfortable option, for preserving their own power at the expense of what might actually be better for humanity. This is the conspiracy of silence. Not a formal agreement, not a coordinated plan, just a collection of institutions that all benefit from the Emperor's continued imprisonment and all lose if he wakes up. Nobody says it out loud. Nobody admits it. But everyone with power in the Imperium understands the calculation. The Emperor's suffering sustains the current system. His awakening would destroy it. So they do nothing. Maintain the throne. Sacrifice the Psychers. Keep him alive but incapable of acting. And call it loyalty. But here's the question nobody wants to ask. Could the Emperor wake up if he wanted to? Not physically. Not leave the throne. That might genuinely be impossible without Terra falling. But could he exert influence? Could he communicate? Could he guide the Imperium even from the throne? The answer is probably yes. To some degree, the Emperor is the most powerful Psyker in human history. Even diminished, even shattered across 10,000 years of agony. He can reach mortal minds, can send visions, can influence events. We know this because it happens. Living saints are a thing. Manifestations of the Emperor's power. Interventions that suggest he's more active than the official narrative admits. So why doesn't he simply tell humanity the truth? Why doesn't he send a vision to every human alive explaining that the imperial cult is heresy? That the ecclesiarchy must be dissolved? That they're betraying his principles? Maybe he can't. Maybe his power is too diffuse, too scattered, too focused on holding the Astronomicon and sealing the webway to manage direct communication. Or maybe he's tried and it hasn't worked. Visions are easy to dismiss, easy to reinterpret. The ecclesiarchy would just call them tests of faith, would argue the Emperor is sending trials to strengthen belief, would twist his message into confirmation of their doctrine. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, he's chosen not to, chosen to remain silent, to let the Imperium believe he's a god, to allow the faith to flourish despite contradicting his teachings. Because faith works. The imperial cult, for all its heresy, provides something the imperial truth never did: meaning, comfort, psychological resilience for populations living in nightmare conditions. The imperial truth was supposed to make humanity rational, strong through understanding. But 10,000 years of constant war has proven that humans need more than rationality. They need something to believe in, something that makes their suffering feel purposeful. Maybe the Emperor has realized this. Maybe he's looked at the galaxy as it currently exists and accepted that the imperial truth won't work. Can't work. Not in a universe this hostile. Not for populations this desperate. Maybe he's chosen to let them worship him because the alternative is despair. And despairing populations are vulnerable to chaos. While populations that believe the Emperor protects them, that their faith matters, that their suffering has cosmic purpose, those populations endure. They survive. And survival is what matters. If that's true, if the Emperor has consciously chosen to accept worship despite his principles, then everything changes. Then his silence isn't imprisonment. It's strategy. Choosing the lesser evil. Accepting faith-based strength over rational vulnerability. But we don't know. Can't know. The Emperor hasn't told us. And anyone who claims to speak for him is either lying or interpreting visions that could mean anything. So we're left with uncertainty. With the question of whether the Emperor is trapped by circumstance or trapped by choice. Whether the institutions preventing his awakening are his enemies or his tools. And in that uncertainty, the Imperium continues. Trapped in the same pattern. worshipping a god who might not want worship, maintaining systems that might contradict his will, sacrificing millions daily to keep him alive while ensuring he never truly returns. It's sustainable. Barely. The Imperium has maintained this balance for 10,000 years. Could probably maintain it for 10,000 more. As long as nothing changes. As long as no one disrupts the careful equilibrium between the Emperor's power and his imprisonment. But equilibriums are fragile. They depend on all forces remaining constant. And in Warhammer 40k, nothing stays constant forever. Eventually, something will break. The throne will fail. The webway breach will widen. The Emperor will heal or die or transform into something else entirely. The galaxy will change in ways that make the current balance impossible to maintain. And when that happens, when the equilibrium finally collapses, the Imperium's leadership won't be ready, because they've spent 10,000 years preparing for everything except the one thing they claim to serve, the Emperor's return. They've built a civilization around his absence, around his silence, around his suffering. They've made themselves necessary by making him helpless. And they've convinced themselves this is what he wants. Maybe it is. Maybe he's looked at the Imperium and decided this nightmare is the best humanity can do. That any alternative would be worse. That his continued agony is worth it if it keeps the species alive. Or maybe he's screaming silently, begging for release, watching the Imperium betray everything he fought for and being unable to stop it. Trapped not just by the throne but by the institutions that claim to serve him while ensuring he can never act. We'll probably never know, because the people with the power to answer that question have every incentive to keep asking it, to maintain the mystery, to preserve the uncertainty that lets them rule in his name while preventing his actual rule. The Emperor is Schrödinger's god, simultaneously trapped and choosing to remain, simultaneously helpless and all-powerful, simultaneously betrayed by his followers and served by them. And the Imperium is terrified of opening that box, of finding out which version is true, because either answer destroys the comfortable lie they've built. If he's trapped against his will, then they're complicit in his torture. Failures who allowed everything he built to collapse. Heretics by his own definition who've spent 10,000 years doing exactly what he forbade. If he's chosen this, if he's accepted worship and faith and all the things he once called poison, then the Great Crusade was a lie. The imperial truth was wrong. And everything he taught them was propaganda for a goal he's abandoned. Neither answer is acceptable. So they don't seek one. Just maintain the status quo. Keep him trapped or keep him choosing to remain trapped. The distinction doesn't matter. Keep the Imperium running on faith and fear and the convenient fiction that this is what he wanted. And pray, genuinely pray in the only way that matters, that he never wakes up to tell them otherwise. Captain General Valoris stood before the Golden Throne, watched the Emperor's ruined form, saw the psychic light flickering, heard the breath that wasn't quite breathing, and he wondered, as he'd wondered every day for 3 centuries, whether the greatest service he could provide would be to step aside, to let whatever happens, happen, to stop protecting the Emperor from the world and start protecting the world from what the Emperor might do. He never would. That wasn't his duty. His duty was to stand watch, to guard, to protect. That's what custodians do. But the question remained. In the silence of the throne room, in the space between heartbeats that might be the Emperor's or might be his own, what happens when he wakes up? And the darker question, the one Valoris would never speak aloud. What if they've all been working to make sure he never does? If you've made it this far, you understand something most people miss about the Imperium. It's not a civilization serving the Emperor. It's a civilization built on his imprisonment, on his silence, on his inability to contradict the narrative they've constructed around him. The tragedy isn't that he's dying. It's that his suffering is useful, that every institution with power benefits from keeping him exactly as he is, that his awakening would be their destruction, and they've convinced themselves this makes them loyal. 3 things before you go. First, hit the like button. This kind of analysis goes deep into the Imperium's structural horror. The algorithm needs engagement to know there's an audience for content that examines the setting's fundamental contradictions. Your like matters. Second, leave a comment answering this question. Do you think the Emperor could wake up if he wanted to? Or is he genuinely trapped by the throne's requirements? I want to know where you stand on whether his imprisonment is circumstance or choice. Third, subscribe if you want more content that goes beneath the surface, that asks uncomfortable questions about the Imperium's heroes and institutions, that treats 40K as a setting worth serious analysis rather than just spectacle. The Emperor protects. That's what they say. What they've said for 10,000 years. But maybe the real question isn't whether he protects humanity. Maybe it's whether humanity would survive him waking up and discovering what they've done in his name. Thanks for watching. The Imperium is terrified of the answer.